So today's talk brings us more than 1,000 years forward from the first few authors of the semester, and we're going to be talking about one of the great foundational early modern philosophers, Descartes. So before giving you a bit of biography about him and working our way in some detail through the text for today, his Meditations on First Philosophy, I want to, as usual, kind of sketch some takeaways that would be good to keep in mind as the discussion gets underway. So the takeaways, this being the reading for today being a completely different realm than the ones we've done so far. That realm, we could call it philosophy of mind. I'm going to say our takeaways are going to be some understanding of what's called mind-body dualism. So we're going to encounter that term, hopefully unpack what it means. And within the context of mind-body dualism, it's going to emerge that Descartes has a very special understanding of what the essence of a human being is. And that essence will be something he calls a thinking being. Another takeaway, I think, is in general to hopefully get a strong understanding of a very famous thought experiment that this reading is known for, the cunning demon thought experiment, which becomes his basis for executing his project of radical doubt. So we're going to talk about that at some length. And then I think a sort of third takeaway for today would be grasping Descartes' view of what can be known about the self, about God, mathematical objects, and the natural world. So he's going to chart pretty specific limits about what can be known or not known about all of those things. I think the kind of technical term, which we don't need to spend too much time on, but it's kind of good to know, is that this would be an example of epistemology, the sort of philosophical study of what can be known. So with that said, I think I'm going to start to share some slides. If you bear with me one moment. It's not giving me the option for a PowerPoint, so I'm going to quit my PowerPoint and restart it. Welcome those who just joined. Good to see you on this gloomy Saturday. Let's see if the share function will work now. Okay, here we go. So Descartes, having said the kind of takeaways for today as mind-body dualism, an understanding of his cunning demon thought experiment, and an understanding of his idea of what can be known and what cannot be known about the self and other things in reality, I'm going to say a few words about who Descartes was. Like I said, we're now more than 1,000 years after the first authors on our syllabus. Descartes is going to have lived and worked in Europe in the really 17th century, and he's famous for a number of things, not just philosophy. And I want to mention what else he's famous for, just to kind of give some context for the reading today, the Meditations on First Philosophy. Not only was Descartes a major philosopher, he was also a serious mathematician and scientist. He's wrote a work called The Geometry, or La Géométrie, which was a key text in the creation of analytic geometry, a kind of precursor to calculus. He wrote a number of other works in physics. I think he wrote a good deal about optics. So for the meditations on first philosophy, I think it's good to keep in mind that, not only does he consider the questions under discussion in that work to be in and of themselves philosophically interesting, but he also is coming at them from the approach of a working scientist. So when he's discussing, raises the question, what can or cannot be known about the mind, what can or cannot be known about bodies in the external world, he's very much thinking of them as a scientist and mathematician. Sort of touch on in passing that Descartes wrote mostly in Latin. That was the kind of language of scholarship and philosophy during his day, but he also wrote in his native tongue, French. He wanted to reach people of good sense, or in the French term of bon sens. There's a sort of famous sentence in another work of his written in French in which he states, "Le bon sens est la chose du monde la mieux partagée." Common sense is the most equitably distributed thing in all of reality, is a claim that he makes. So not only was he writing very often for kind of specialists like himself and his colleagues, but he also seemed to think that his philosophy could and should be shared with the non-specialist. So I want to pass the microphone a bit to some of you. And before we get into details of the reading for today, and I think my hope is that we will be able to work through the kind of main arguments in this reading. I think a perfectly good way to start is with the title, Meditations on First Philosophy. So you all tell me maybe we could start with the word on the left. What does it mean to you? What does it evoke to you? Okay, so I see a raised hand. Sam, please jump in.
Yeah, I think to me, it just is like meditations means that we've been thinking, we've been pondering. So I think also based off the reading, it's like, he's read some of the first takes on philosophy and he's like, I've got some thoughts. So kind of like meditating, sort of like, thinking about the other arguments that have been presented and sort of jumping into the conversation, I think, giving his little 2 cents.
Yeah, absolutely. I like your use of the word pondering. I mean, something about meditation evokes to me that it's thinking, but it's a special kind of thinking. It's not like just trying to, solve a calculation in geometry or something like that. It's sitting back, mulling it over, chewing on it, indeed pondering. Thank you for that. So any other thoughts? What does meditation evoke to some other students?
I would say reflection on what you believe, on everything that it's about you, and the present and the past, and everything you have learned.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think Descartes shows throughout these meditations, it's a series of 6 of them, that they're very reflective, and that it's not just him thinking something through, but then pausing and looking back on it and really trying to absorb it. One thing that I would mention is that for me, and I think for a lot of readers, meditation has an almost religious connotation. I think of meditation as something, kind of, you might think of monks and nuns as doing, lives of prayer and meditation, kind of shutting oneself off and really reflecting on something. So although there's a lot of talk about God in the Meditations on First Philosophy, it's not an explicitly Christian practice that Descartes is undertaking, but I think he's evoking or touching on that sort of tradition of religious reflection that would have been very prevalent in his day. And you certainly see to an extent nowadays, and maybe removing some of the religious aspects of it, but maintaining this idea of practice, about thinking in isolation and very reflectively. So how about the other term in the title, first philosophy? Descartes probably has in mind something very specific with this phrase, but has anyone encountered it before? Or even if you haven't, what would it suggest to you? Okay, Maya, I see your hand is raised. Go for it.
This is I'm guessing it's sort of the philosophy that you need to do before the other philosophies.
Yeah, I think that's a great way of putting it. It's gesturing at the most fundamental questions that there are, that somehow if there's an order to questioning things in a philosophical way, the branch of philosophy called first philosophy would be concerned with the questions that are sort of at the foundation of everything else. Another term for this branch of philosophy is metaphysics. I think it's interesting that Descartes did not use that term. He went with the other phrase, first philosophy. Metaphysics is actually a lot of dispute in philosophy nowadays, naturally. Find lots of dispute in pretty much every aspect of philosophy. But even on this very fundamental seeming term, there's a question about what metaphysics really is. But something that might be good to know is that the term, like many of our words in the philosophical vocabulary we're developing, does come from the Greek, comes back to that very foundational figure we encountered last time, Aristotle. And interestingly, slash slightly confusingly, the term metaphysics it's not a title Aristotle himself applied to any of his works, as far as I know, but it was a kind of label applied to works of his that came after a book of his that he did call the Physics. So literally and slightly confusingly, metaphysics can be translated as after the physics, as in Aristotle's physics, even though metaphysics often attempts to deal with questions that, in a sense, come first or are foundational to issues that arise in physics. Something that might make it a bit more clear, hopefully, is kind of comparing physics and metaphysics. If you think of astronomy as having to deal with the motion of the planets around the sun, or the distance from the Earth to stars, the rotation of the cosmos, metaphysics will ask what motion itself is. Similarly, physics will try to determine how long, what length of time it takes for the moon to complete a cycle around the Earth. Metaphysics will ask what time is. So hopefully those are sort of examples of, so like, what is motion? What is time? What is the self? For Descartes will be a metaphysical question. So those are the kind of things that will be under discussion in metaphysics broadly, and some of it in the reading for today. So a few kind of key distinctions to keep in mind as we work through Descartes' arguments really come down to, I think the fundamental one is sort of in the middle of the items on the left, internal, external. It's like an all-pervading distinction in the 6 meditations on first philosophy for Descartes. He seems to draw pretty early on in the writing a sharp distinction between an inner world and an external world. we might want to ask ourselves, is that a good way of thinking about reality? But Descartes seems to do that from the outset. Another key distinction for Descartes, sort of at the top, is sense perception versus thinking. Early on in the Meditations, he expresses strong distrust for the senses, seems to think that they're very unreliable. And the examples he comes up with, I think, at one point he states, frequently it'll happen that you see someone at a distance, but how do you know it is the person who it looks like? How do you know it's not a robot? Or from a long distance, you'll see a monument that looks like a rectangle, but when you get close to it, it looks like a cylinder. So I think that those kind of distinctions or those kind of issues are what make him very distrustful of sense perception and resort to thinking and thinking alone. And Descartes, at some point in the writing, he raises the question, is all thought ultimately derived from the senses? He'll argue no. But anyway, that's a key distinction for him that pervades the whole work. And then mind-body dualism, one of our quote-unquote key takeaways for today. So I definitely want to state right away that it's not a term that Descartes wrote himself. It's really kind of a description that commentators have applied to Descartes' view, but he'll end up arguing, kind of in keeping with that internal-external sense perception versus thinking distinction that pervades the work, that mind and body are separate, they're dual, they're two different things. And we'll get to why that is in the course of the Meditations for him. And then some sort of concepts that underlie this entire work. Skepticism. I think there's a lot of skepticism in a basic sense in a lot of the philosophers we have encountered and will continue to encounter. But you all tell me, what is skepticism to you? I'm sure it's a term you hear all the time. Don't be so skeptical. Oh, okay. Maya, yes, please.
Doubting things?
Yeah, absolutely. Skepticism is a stance of doubt. I think I saw another hand raised. Feel free to chime in. Any other thoughts? Aryan, please.
I think it's like doubting about like what's right or wrong, and like if something is right, like why is it right and why is it not wrong?
Yeah, absolutely. Doubt, like Maya was also saying, is a big part of it. Is it good or bad to be skeptical? Is that even a consideration when we're talking about skepticism? Or can we not really make a generality? I don't think you can. I just want to see if anyone else thought you can. Skepticism in a philosophical sense, to me, will mean a kind of attitude not only of doubt. I mean, I think doubt, as Maya and Aryan mentioned, is a key aspect of skepticism, but suspending judgment about the things that are being doubted. So it'll be launching on an investigation like Descartes does and forcing oneself not to take things for granted, not to jump to conclusions, and really hold off from passing judgment on whatever it is that's under discussion until you feel you've resolved the question. And that will turn out to require a good amount of discipline. I think Descartes shows, I mean, a theme throughout the writing is how hard it is to undertake the kind of radical skepticism that he attempts to do in the Meditations. Sort of another term for Descartes, rationalism. For Descartes, it will mean adhering to the view that knowledge must be rooted in reason. You might think that that's obvious enough for a philosopher, but if we remember that Descartes is talking about really fundamental things, including the self and God, I think that shows that sort of running out. We've kind of lost steam on this one, but he'll bring a rational approach to areas that others might try to resolve through faith. So a lot of times, especially in Descartes' climate, questions about God, especially, and maybe the self as well, would be matters that can only be resolved by religion. But for him, he'll insist on understanding God and the self through reason alone. And another term, good to keep in mind, kind of thing I might put on a quiz also, is foundationalism. Descartes says early on in the Meditations that he's seeking a solid basis, a firm foundation for knowledge in the questions that he's seeking answers to. So before going into the specific meditations, and we are going to spend a good amount of time working through them in some detail, just want to give an overview. So 6 meditations. I'm not sure if that number has deeper significance now that I say it out loud. Kind of reminds me of creation in Genesis, but maybe that's intentional, maybe it's not. At any rate, in the first meditation, Descartes kind of sets out his project of radical doubt, stating that he is going to doubt everything that it is possible to do, and arguing that if you want to be serious about the acquisition of knowledge, that is something that must be undertaken. It's also where he sort of introduces and starts to explore this very famous thought experiment centering on the cunning demon, which might be thought of as a kind of device to goad Descartes to doubt things, to be skeptical to the maximum. It's in the second meditation that we get the sort of resolution that Descartes, of the doubt Descartes has about the self, and the beginnings of his answering what can be known about things other than the self in the external world. And that comes in the form of a sort of very famous sentence, I think I exist. So we'll have to unpack what that means. In the third meditation, Descartes kind of reflects on what he's been experiencing so far and realizes that he has come upon the kind of standard or criterion for the truth of how you can tell what is true from what is not true. And the terms in the translation that was on Blackboard for that criterion is vivid and clear. He'll say something that is thought with vividness and clarity, he will take to be true. He also brings in a proof of the existence of God, and which he says he needs to resolve all of the doubt that he had tried to entertain about himself and the external world. Descartes, in the fourth meditation, will address the question, if he has this great standard for knowing what the truth is, why do mistakes happen? So we'll talk about his answer for that. It might seem a sort of funny question. Why do humans make mistakes? It's like, well, what could be more obvious? Mistakes happen all the time. But Descartes, as part, I think, of his rigorous project of answering metaphysical questions, will insist on coming to an answer to that question. In the second to last meditation, the fifth one, Descartes starts to bring things to the outside world, having kind of established that he exists and that God exists. He'll state that mathematical bodies, not necessarily ones that are on a chalkboard or exemplified by architecture, but the mathematical bodies one thinks, ones that, so to speak, happen in the mind, also exist. And then he'll bring a new, what he terms a new proof of God in to bolster that statement. And it's at the end, really, that Descartes gives that his formulation for what the mind is in comparison to the body, he will state that these are distinct things with some overlap. And he'll leave us with his kind of final idea about what can be known about the outside world. So you can think of it as a trajectory from him asking what can be known about the self. He brings in God to answer that question. And then he progresses to mathematical things, keeping in mind that he's a practicing scientist. What can be known about mathematical things will be very important to him. And then it's at the sort of very end of this process that he starts talking about those objects of sense perception, what you smell, see, hear, touch, etc., that he had been so skeptical about, what can be known about them. And that turns out to be limited in Descartes' view. One thing that I sort of meant to mention earlier, but now's as good a time as any, is what I find interesting. I mean, I not only find these questions in and of themselves interesting, but I mean, this piece of literature has quite a legacy. Up until today, that mind-body distinction is used to frame debates about the brain. Contemporary philosophy of mind is still very interested with the same things Descartes was. So we can, and we're going to get some examples of that toward the end of the semester. And it might not be a bad question to ask, has progress been made on answering the kind of questions Descartes has proposed, or that he posed something like 400 years ago? Okay, for first meditation is where Descartes, right off the bat, gives us a sense of what the scope of his project is. So would someone maybe who hasn't spoken yet like to read this passage on the left for everyone? Don't be shy. Okay, I see a hand raised. Briley, go for it.
Some years ago, I was struck by how many false things I had believed, and by how doubtful was the structure of beliefs that I had based on them. I realized that if I wanted to establish anything in the sciences that was stable and likely to last, I needed just once in my life to demolish everything, completely start again from the foundations.
Okay, thank you for that, Briley. So what's going on here? What is Descartes up to? This is very autobiographical, right? I mean, I think Descartes is stating that it's necessary, if you are a thoughtful person, to not take anything for granted. And like he says, at least once in one's life, doubt everything, doubt not just everything, but the structure of beliefs that are behind everything that had kind of previously been taken for granted. I mean, is this a good idea? I mean, he's a very smart guy. There's presumably other ways he could have spent his time. Is this appeal to us as a worthwhile philosophical and personal project? He's the first person right off the bat. Yes, Mike.
It does seem to me like something that it would be really good to do, just because, yeah, just looking at what you believe and making sure you believe it for the right reasons seems really important.
Yeah, absolutely. So what do you think? I mean, I tend to agree with that sentiment. But what about the way Descartes goes about it? I think what he states is, I mean, it's not a question we need to answer right away, but I think, one way to interpret the very beginning of the meditations is that he states he's not going to doubt specific things. He's trying to get at the basis of knowledge in general. He's asking, can people be sure of their claims to knowledge with their present definition of what knowledge is? So for him to answer that question, he says he's going to have to demolish, and if he can, rebuild the foundations for knowledge. I mean, and this is Descartes again writing in the first person. There's something very personal about this to me. I think there's a suggestion that if you take the problems he raises seriously, that we're kind of supposed to follow in his footsteps, doubt everything. That I find that to be a somewhat intimidating prospect. I don't know if I'm capable of doubting everything, or definitely, or doing it in the way that Descartes does. So would someone, maybe again who hasn't spoken yet, like to, I see a hand raised. Yes, Sam.
Yeah, I mean, I think my personal opinion on it is like, yeah, I think it's really important to think about like why you believe what you believe and like how you came to that conclusion. But I just think like starting from the ground up, like as a philosopher, that's great. It gives you something to do, but it also gives you a lot to do. And um I don't know, I just think that there are some things that are just kind of like common sense. And I just think as a person with like a job who has things to do, I'm just like, I don't think personally I could ever do that. I think if I wanted to start from the ground up, I would have to live in a cave. So
Yeah.
I think it's a very interesting take. I mean, I think granted it's a very like philosophical take. So I mean it leaves you with a lot to think about, right? I mean, I think there's some that we can definitely apply to our lives now and say like, okay, well, why do I believe what I believe and what does this say about me? And how can I continue to build like a more solid foundation for my identity? But I think also at the same time, it's just kind of like a lot. Yeah, I agree with you. It's a lot, almost too much.
Yeah. And there's a question of how practical this undertaking is. I mean, Descartes doesn't put a number of days on how long the meditations took him, but he's describing, he's kind of recounting an experience, and presumably it took at least a few days, I don't know, a few weeks. But there is something in, I think, like if I'm understanding you correctly, like you're saying, that is maybe a bit impractical about this undertaking. But then that to me raises the question, who says everything has to be practical? And a point of departure for me for taking Descartes' project seriously is, I like to think of myself as a thoughtful person. So, and I read the news, I've worked in the news. So I'm not going to take for granted, the things I was raised to believe, such as democracy is the best form of government. It's like, okay, if you want to do that, then you have to read a bunch of books about political philosophy and government. Fine. But then that raises more questions. Like, do you take for granted what human beings are supposed to do in day-to-day life? Do you take for granted all kinds of things? And then the question is, at what level do you say, okay, I've done enough of this, or do you just have to keep on going deeper and deeper? And I think Descartes is saying that, yeah, there is you have to go really deep if you want to be serious about not just taking things on faith and kind of making them your own. That would be that would be one defense of what Descartes is doing. But I agree with you, it's questionable how practical it is. And he says early on in the first meditation, this sort of thought experiment I'm doing makes me akin to a mad person. So there's that sort of specter in throughout the work, to my mind, of, you know, whether or not what he's doing is crazy. But he will give limits early on to try to make his project executable. And before I say those limits, I see another hand raised. So Evelyn, yes.
So I remember reading about his personal life, and apparently he was grown really into church. So everything around him, it was connected to church. So I can imagine him seeing all the scientists at the same time perhaps being persecuted by the church because of their beliefs. So I think there was probably a lot for him to take into consideration, that despite being men of science, their beliefs into a certain way did limit them in a way. And even though they were philosophers, I think he probably went to that detachment and more like our self-seeking knowledge, instead of just taking a personality from an institution and making it yours. So I think Descartes probably was going through this. He was just trying to be like self-actualize himself with everything that was going around him, instead of just becoming that man, a man of faith, a man of church, as a taking as a way to identify yourself.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think you're right about the context that Descartes lived in. I mean, I don't know his biography that intimately. I want to say that he was sort of Jesuit educated, so Catholic educated, but not 100% sure. But yeah, he was definitely living in a time where faith was taken for time and place, when faith in God was very much the standard and taken for granted. So it would require a special effort on his part to try to tackle questions of faith in a rational way. Another good question we should keep in mind, while reading this is, given the atmosphere of censorship, Evelyn, that you touched on during Descartes' day, do we buy that he believes in God? Because he says he does. He says he's proven the existence of God. But whenever I read this text, I wonder if Descartes really means that. So I'm not going to read this quote, but he, early on in the Meditations, kind of gives the scope of his project by stating he's not going to question literally every detail about everything that he knows. He says that is probably more than I could manage, sort of bring it back to the practicality question. But he's going to go for the kind of foundational aspects of knowledge, and provides right away a basis for doubt about those foundational aspects. We'll say if they are not completely certain and indubitable, something that cannot be doubted, he will not agree to them. And so for these kind of foundational areas of knowledge, if there's even some reason for doubt, he's not going to allow himself to take them to be true or to believe in them. If he applied this to every detail about everything in his existence, that would, quote unquote, take forever. He doesn't want to do that. The question in passing for us, though, is where does this idea of certain and indubitable come from? How do you know something is certain and cannot be doubted? Because Descartes says this right off the bat, that it's suggesting that he'll be able to tell what you can or cannot doubt. It's like, okay, it's easy enough for me to doubt, is democracy the best form of government? It's easy enough for me to doubt, long-standing marriage practices or something. But how do I know where do you know? How do you know where to stop? I mean, Descartes says it seems like Descartes stops around the level of one's identity. He'll say it can be doubted whether you actually even have an identity, but why stop there? So that would be an open question to me. What is even capable of being doubted? For Descartes, it's what admits of at least some doubt. But then, what is certainty in comparison to that? It's an interesting term that is not entirely certain and indubitable, not entirely spelled out right away. So, mentioned at the beginning, kind of one of the key concepts for this whole reading is foundationalism. Descartes says when he's the sort of target of his doubt are the foundations for his beliefs. So that's what he is going to attempt to demolish. And right away, he kind of goes on the attack against the senses, stating that up until he started this project of meditating on the sort of first things in philosophy, he thought that nothing was truer in the world than what comes through the senses, than what is smelled, seen, touched, tasted, etc., etc. And so, given this kind of standard that he's provided us, that if anything can be doubted even a little bit, you should not trust it. He realizes that the sense perceptions have deceived him all the time. It is unwise to trust completely those who have deceived us even once. So right away, he's eliminating anything that comes from the senses from his thinking. And he's going to say that he has to try to come up with a firm basis to believe in what comes through the senses. And if you think about it, that, to my mind, covers a lot of what happens in human experience. I mean, if we think about what's literally happening right now, we're in front of computers, they have lights that enable us to see. We're all looking at the same PowerPoint slide. We're listening to each other talk. It's like sound waves that we think are being transmitted, et cetera, et cetera. But Descartes is stating that none of that, because there's a little bit of room for doubt about the knowledge that comes from the senses, none of that will be admissible from his project, at least not right away. Okay, so with something that's right in front of you, it might be hard to apply this idea of doubting the senses, other than, there could be distortion or a bad Wi-Fi connection that makes some of the sounds get mixed up. But I do like Descartes' examples that come from seeing things at a distance. If I look out my window, there's another building, could sort of see shadowy figures in the apartment across the street. It might look like an adult and a child, but maybe it's not. Maybe it's a huge child and a small robot, or there are all kinds of experiences where the senses lead one to make one kind of assumption, but then it turns out to be false. So that ability to doubt the senses makes Descartes reject them as a possible basis of knowledge. So he's going to have to look in another direction. That direction will be inward. There's some other reasons for skepticism that of the senses that he provides. The dreaming issue is always an interesting one to me. So I'm not sure how I feel about dreams, but he states that dreaming can seem as realistic as being awake. How would one know they're not dreaming all the time? I have a hard time entertaining that one. We don't need to spend too much talking about it, but I tend to think I know when I'm awake or when I'm asleep. But for Descartes, I think he would point out that when you're experiencing a dream, it seems as real as if you were awake, and you don't know while you're in a dream that you're dreaming necessarily. I think sometimes you do, but Descartes suggests that you don't. So that would be another reason to doubt the experiences of the senses. Similarly, he points out mad people do not know they're mad. Maybe all of the things that one has trusted in for their entire life, and even the things that happen, in the moment, are completely baseless, are a product of some kind of delusion or quote unquote craziness, but you just don't know it. I think the examples for Descartes are, a poor person who truly believes that they're a king or a queen. They don't know that they're not a king or a queen. So maybe he has the same relation to his senses that a madman or woman does to this idea that they're a king or a queen. He does not know that he's mad. He does not know that the senses that he's had trusted on throughout his whole life are false. And right away, kind of going back to the point Evelyn touched on, he states that God is good and God would not deceive his creations. So then this leads Descartes to come up with his sort of famous thought experiment about a malicious demon. And we can ask whether we could be, I think we should be skeptical. Does he really believe the things that he says about God? But he's not willing, after he states that, points out the ways that the sense perceptions are unreliable, he's not willing to state that God could have created reality to be radically deceptive. So instead, he could sort of contrives an idea to force him to radically question everything. And that idea is the malicious demon that is constantly deceiving him. Would someone, maybe who hasn't spoken yet, like to read the passage on the left?
Could I read it?
Yes, please.
So I shall suppose that some malicious, powerful, cunning demon has done all he can to deceive me, rather than this being done by God, who is supremely good and the source of truth. I shall think that the sky, the air, the earth, colors, shapes, sounds, and all external things are merely dreams that the demon has contrived as traps for my judgment. I shall consider myself as having no hands or eyes or flesh, or blood or sense, but as having falsely believed that I had all these things. I shall stubbornly persist in this train of thought, and even if I can't learn any truth, I shall at least do what I can do, which is to be on my guard against accepting any falsehoods, so that the deceiver, however powerful and cunning he may be, will be unable to affect me in the slightest.
Great. Yes, thank you for that. So this is the kind of force, this malicious demon, that Descartes will say he, in a sense, has to answer to. He is going to proceed as though there is a cunning demon that has has turned reality essentially into a deception. And if he can't disprove that those things are deceptions, then he will not let himself accept that. So it goes down to a, at the most seemingly minute level, things that the comes across but through touch, through vision. He can sort of, through this contrivance, think of as having been created by a malevolent, ill-intended outside power. And unless he can find some basis that would prove those things exist independent of a hypothetical malevolent demon, he will not accept them as true or as real. And interestingly, it's around this same passage that Descartes sort of drops in this idea that the complicated sciences, again, him being a scientist, like physics and astronomy, they're too immersed in the senses. They cannot be trusted. But then he states that the so-called simple sciences, like arithmetic, counting, and geometry deal with things that are innately certain and indubitable. So there's that term again from the very first page in the Meditations. So he's suggesting that those are acceptable right off the bat, even before he's begun the project of trying to answer to the so-called cunning demon. One thing that I will mention in passing is that even though this thought experiment has been very celebrated since Descartes wrote it and considered influential for philosophy of mind, metaphysics, and epistemology ever since, is that it does bear an uncanny resemblance to a much earlier work in this sort of Arabic Islamic tradition by a philosopher who sadly is not on our syllabus, but his name is Avicenna or Ibn Sina, and he wrote, I think, a few centuries before Descartes, a very, very similar thought experiment that's known as the Flying Man, where he proposes basically a human being deprived of sense perception to sort of prove his own theory about the nature of the mind. So just something to mention in passing, that even though our syllabus is, for better or worse, very Eurocentric, it's not necessarily all original. There's lots of thought from other traditions that we're unfortunately missing out on. So I'm just going to take a moment to look at the chat. So George raised a question: is Descartes trying to say that our definition of knowledge is only considered to be knowledge because we all believe it to be? In order to find the truth, you have to doubt everything you already know. I think the short answer is yes. But I wouldn't say that, for Descartes, the problem to start with is not that people, or he, this is very much from a first person perspective, his problem is not that he bases his knowledge on faith in kind of public or general definitions of knowledge. It's that it's really the sense perception thing, I think, is the point of departure for Descartes. It's that the problem is the things he had thought of as most true came from the senses, but he's coming up with reasons not to take those for granted. And yes, this line of thought, Sam wrote, feels like it's leading to a psychotic break. I hope not. How does anybody doubt the truth of their reality while not feeling insane? I mean, I think that's a great point. I think what Descartes might answer is that it comes through maintaining focus on the right questions and setting a parameter for a kind of way out. Because, like I said, he states right off the bat that he's limiting his doubt to things that are not certain and indubitable. So I think the hope is that he can establish things that are certain and indubitable and basically avoid, creating an existence for himself, which is just endless kind of vertigo of doubt or a psychotic break. So yeah, hopefully Descartes has provides a way out of this kind of maze from early on. Evelyn points out that this reminds her of Socrates, who claimed all that he knows is that he knows nothing. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's an interesting comparison, because Socrates claims that he knew nothing, debatable claim. Descartes is going to act like he knows nothing. But yeah, there'd be a lot, I think, that could be said about comparing the approach of the two of them. Okay, I want to get to the next slide. Also, I think at about 3:10, we'll take a short break. So I want to go over the second meditation first. So this to me really is the heart of the Meditations, where Descartes begins to really answer the question about what can be known and what cannot be known. and starting with the self. And he begins by stating, yesterday's meditation has thrown me into such doubts that I can no longer ignore them, yet I fail to see how they are to be resolved. He feels like he's fallen into a deep whirlpool. Nevertheless, he insists that he will work his way up and attempt to stay on the path, putting aside everything that admits of the least doubt, and he will stay on this course until he knows something certain. So entertaining this thought experiment that a malicious demon has essentially created all of reality as a fake to deceive Descartes. Descartes, that provides the basis for Descartes for doubting anything, not only through the senses, but the most fundamental things, even apparently whether he himself exists. Because if that's the idea, is that the demon has such extraordinary power that not only does the outside world not evidently exist, but the sort of inside world comes under question also. But it's in the course of entertaining that kind of train of thought that Descartes seems to realize that if I convinced myself of something, I certainly existed, or if he is being deceived by this hypothetical deceiving demon, then there is something that exists that is being deceived. So he realizes that his thought, even if only during the instance that it's taking place, provides evidence that he exists. And the way he phrases it is, I am, I exist, is true every time it is asserted or thought. Another phrasing is that even though this demon can seemingly have the power to cancel out everything else from sense perception, about the structure of the world that Descartes is in, one thing the demon cannot do is negate the thought from Descartes that I think I am something. So he begins to build almost a kind of system for knowledge just on the basis of that observation. And right away, it kind of begins expanding on it. For as long as I am thinking, I exist, Descartes asserts. I want to mention in passing that there are different Descartes phrases this in different ways in different writings. If any of you have come across Descartes before, or Cartesian thought, then the phrase you probably came across was a translation of the French. Je pense donc je suis. I think, therefore I am. It also comes in a Latin version in yet another work, cogito ergo sum. But it's in this work, what we get is I am, comma, I exist. Don't want to spend too much time on this, but I think it would be worth trying to mull over, maybe meditate on what are the differences between the ways Descartes phrases this assertion. Maybe before I could give my take, but I'd be curious what some of you think. What's the difference between saying I am, comma, I exist, and I probably should have put the English here instead, but hopefully you can see toward the bottom, I think, therefore I am. Je pense donc je suis. To me, the phrasing I am, comma, I exist is almost more raw or even primordial compared to the formulation, I think, therefore I am. I think the I am, comma, I exist is meant to convey the sort of immediacy of Descartes' observation. It suggests that, I exist is contained in the assertion I am, whereas I think therefore I am, this cogito ergo sum, implies a more complicated development of thought, which Descartes, even though he could definitely do it, isn't willing to let himself do until he's established this more fundamental truth that I am, comma, I exist. The word therefore would seem to imply a lot of things. It's this kind of logical operation that would seem to assume effect follows cause. For instance, he's been so insistent on his project of radical doubt. I think at this point, he was not even willing to assume that effect follows cause. Hence, the only assertion, or the best way for him to formulate this assertion is I am, comma, I exist. And I saw a comment in the chat. Marcus said, Descartes is trying to make a point that if people are not presently acknowledging and asserting thoughts, then their very presence is in question. I think that's an interesting way of putting it. If I understand you correctly, Marcus, you're sort of stating that conscious awareness of a thought is required for someone to be present or to exist. I assume Descartes considers himself conscious when he's doing this thought experiment. But I think your sort of observation, Marcus, raises a lot of interesting questions. But I think he's on the level yet where he's still on a level where he's not distinguishing between conscious and unconscious. He's limiting himself to the moment, however long that might be, that he thinks the thought, I am, comma, I exist. So I know that doesn't directly answer what you're getting at, Marcus, but I might ask you to hold on to this thought. Hopefully we all remember it for closer to the end of the semester when we're going to read some contemporary philosophy of mind that goes into some specifics about what makes a thought conscious or not. So as Descartes is exploring this idea that he exists as long as he is thinking, he sort of generates a definition of what he himself is, seemingly providing an answer to one of the key metaphysical questions or questions of first philosophy. What is a human being? It's like, well, for Descartes, that is the status of being a thinking being. And right away, he gives a number of attributes of what a thinking being is. So he's already demonstrated the very first attribute on this list. A thinking being doubts almost everything. That's what he's been doing this entire time for these two meditations. It understands some things. It affirms this one thing so far, that I exist and think. It denies everything else, wants to know more, etc., etc. He'll state that this thinking being is not a soul, like wind, fire, or ether, that would bring in too many outside things that seem to come from the senses. So Descartes is not willing to assert that at all. But he is aware that there seem to be many things that seem to come from the senses. So that brings him to begin his serious exploration of what can be known about the outside world, which ultimately, again, as a scientist, is one of the main things that he's interested in. And for him, the example is a piece of wax. For those of you who had a chance to read the second meditation, could you maybe tell me, what is Descartes getting at with this whole long discussion of the experience of seeing a piece of wax melt at the end of the second meditation? What's that about? Okay, I see a hand raised. Yes, Maya.
I'm really not sure I had this right. This part kind of confused me, so I'm just gonna say what I thought I got out of it.
Yeah, please.
It seemed like he was saying, like, so he had wax in his hand and it was hard and he could like bang it on the table and it would make a sound. And he was saying like, what is and then when it melted, like obviously he couldn't do that anymore. So the properties of the wax had changed. So he was kind of saying like, but it's still the same wax. So he was kind of saying like, what makes this the same wax?
Yes. Yeah. You hit on what for Descartes is the key question. And again, the context being what can be known about the outside world. He says, habit makes you think bodies are more real than yourself. He's going to end up concluding that that's not the case. And the reason for that is, yeah, the way he answers the question, how does he know, what's the difference between solid wax and melted wax? And how does he know that? And what he concludes, I mean, it's very strange and counterintuitive. I mean, he talks about, the wax before it melts might have a honey scent. When it's knocked, it sounds like a hard object when it's knocked, and these various other attributes. But when it's melted, maybe the scent is gone, or maybe it smells different. Definitely when he knocks it, it doesn't make the same sound. And all the other sense properties have changed. So the question is, what has remained the same? How does he know it's the same piece of wax if all of the sensual attributes of it are different? So for him, the essence of a piece of wax is none other than that it is something his term is extended, flexible, and changeable. So that's the essence of wax. All the other stuff is supposed to be secondary. And the other key attribute of that kind of process of recognizing a thing in the outside world is that it's only scrutiny by the mind alone that made that key distinction. Nothing that the senses seemed to tell him about the wax was informative of what the wax's essence is. It's just a mental process. And so that would seem to, I think, for one, undermine or negate the idea that outside bodies are more real than the self, this vague thinking being, because it's trying to show that their seemingly most important attributes are unreliable. And he's also given, a definition for what a piece of wax is, and I think it's supposed to apply to all bodies in the outside world. But I think for the context here, he states that the wax example really reinforces his statement that I exist because it was only through thought, quote unquote, scrutiny by the mind alone, that he was able to determine what a piece of wax was. But he's also started to kind of chart what can and cannot be known about the outside world, which may seem like it's not a lot. Doesn't seem like much to me. But at any rate, was that sort of clear? Or I mean, it doesn't. I have trouble with it myself, but I think the main thing is that it's just he has this counterintuitive idea that basically none of the sense aspects of the outside world give us an idea of what the essence of objects in the outside world is. It's only this very abstract seeming thing extension, in the case of wax, flexibility and changeability, that is the essence of an outside object, and it's only the mind that is able to distinguish them. So it's an interesting question. Okay, I see something in the chat. Can we relate this to people instead of just objects? Tangina asked. That's a good question. What does anybody want to answer Tangina's question? Does this discussion of wax, according to Descartes, apply to other people? I could take a very quick stab at that question and say, I think Descartes would argue that the sense-based knowledge we have about other people is just as uncertain as the sense-based knowledge about a piece of wax. I'm not 100% sure how he would define the essence of a human other than himself. He has said that his essence is that he is a thinking being. So presumably he thinks other people are also thinking beings. But then the question would arise, how does he know that about anyone other than himself if he has rejected sensory information about other humans as a basis for knowledge? How would he know that other human beings exist? That's a great question. There's not an easy answer to it. And with that said, it's 3:15 by, actually, let's see, it's 3:13 by my clock now. So let's take a 5-minute break and then come back at 3:18. Does that sound good? Okay, thank you. So Descartes, by this point, which is the end of the second meditation with 4 to go, has claimed that he has, after kind of radically doubting everything in existence, proven that he himself exists, and also provided a number of attributes for what he is. A thinking being that doubts, that assents to some things, that involuntarily acquires ideas about other things. But a skeptic, if we're going to be skeptical about the skeptic, might reply that Descartes has not yet accomplished anything regarding what's most important about the outside world. So we have to sort of wait and see, will Descartes provide a path for getting to that knowledge? I'm going to bring the screen back up, the slide back up again. It's in the third meditation that Descartes kind of reflects on what he's concluded up to then and realizes that he has come upon a standard for the truth. And this, in the translation for the reading today, sometimes it's phrased differently or translated differently, is that if something is vivid and clear, then it cannot be otherwise than it is firm and truthful. So Descartes realizes that that assertion, I am, I exist, otherwise phrased as I think, therefore I am, is totally vivid and clear to him, sometimes also translated as clear and distinct. Then he reflects, doesn't that observation tell him what it takes for him to be certain about anything? In this first item of knowledge, there is simply a vivid and clear perception of what I am asserting. This wouldn't be enough to make me certain of its truth if it could ever turn out that something that I perceived so vividly and clearly was false. So I now seem to be able to lay it down as a general rule that whatever I perceive vividly and clearly is true. So we have it, it would seem. Nevertheless, Descartes because he is trying to doubt everything possible, has to ask, is it possible that God, not the malevolent demon, but he goes back to God, he thinks he's answered the possibility posed by the malevolent demon that everything is false with this standard of vivid and clear thought. But maybe God constructed reality in such a way that even vivid and clear thoughts could be false. However, and Descartes will have a lot more to say about God, he says God is a perfect entity. It is impossible for God to have allowed Descartes to have vivid and clear perceptions that are false. Therefore, vivid and clear perceptions are reliable and true. Those perceptions include, according to Descartes, the existence of God, which might be a huge problem if we ourselves do not necessarily have a vivid and clear perception of God. Nevertheless, this is something like how the argument goes, which some critics would say makes Descartes guilty of circular reasoning. Vivid and clear perceptions are true because God would not create a reality in which they are false. And God would not create a reality in which vivid and clear perceptions are true because Descartes has a vivid and clear perception that that is how God operates. So you all tell me, are you satisfied with this, first of all, definition of a standard of truth according to Descartes? Again, that whatever I perceive very vividly and clearly is true. And are you satisfied with his kind of defense of that, which brings in God?
I don't agree actually. I feel like it's a cat chasing his own tail and it goes back to zero. The reason why I think it doesn't make sense for me because he's still attributing, for example, the evil part, the confusing part of humanity to demons. But the thing is that he kind of like doesn't take into consideration that most people are not him or don't even stand will not even do the self acknowledgement or reflections as part of their daily life. They're not even aware of this information, and he's probably just thinking on his mind that everybody is at the same mentality as he is, and that's far away from the truth. And maybe those demons that what he calls probably the unawareness of ignorance or lack of humanity, whatever. There's so many reasons why our and dynamics playing a role why our world can be bad or bad things happen around the world, just not demons. For example, you can say a demon is the cause for natural disasters. There's so many things and that can be the reason for that. So I'm just a bit confused here.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I think at this point, Descartes hasn't said anything about other human beings. He's talking only about himself and God. So I guess my question is, I put it differently, and by this point in the meditations, basically stops talking about the idea of a malevolent, deceptive demon. It's just one demon in his thought experiment. And that demon was endowed with the ability to make everything false. So Descartes thinks that he has dispelled the demon, so to speak, by asserting that he himself exists and that that's something that the demon can never disprove to him. So then he's trying to, we can argue whether or not he's successfully answered the problem posed by the demon. But at this point, he's trying to build on that one initial assertion and explore what else he can know with equal certainty. So that's where he argues that if something is vividly and clearly perceived, it is true, and God could not have created reality otherwise. So that's my question: is do we find one, the other, or both sides of that persuasive? I mean, I'll say that clearly just by I'm skeptical, but then the problem is if I don't agree with Descartes' standard for what is true, can I come up with a better one? The answer is no. But maybe then is this the best that philosophy can do to provide a standard for the truth? That if something is vividly and clearly perceived, it is true. Is there any more fundamental basis that can be established than that? So see, Sam wrote in the chat, it's confusing to argue that God is inherently existent because of our belief in him, but also that things that are not vivid are imaginative and therefore not true. Yeah, I mean, I think you can play around with this phrase, vivid and clear. There are some things that are vivid and unclear, and some things that might be clear but are not vivid. I think an example of something that's vivid but not clear for Descartes is pain, which toward the end of the Meditations exemplifies his lasting skepticism of bodily things. I mean, the God is, if we are skeptical, sort of cueing again off of Sam's point, that God exists, is Descartes' standard for the truth salvageable, or does it rise and fall with the existence of God according to him? Yeah, Marcus wrote, Sam made a great point, which I agree with. It seems like Descartes is contradicting himself. I mean, he's arguing, he obviously would not think that he's contradicting himself. I think the issue is his proof for the validity of vivid and clear perceptions being true adequate or inadequate? And Sam states that this is black and white thinking. I think that is a good way to characterize it. Something is either true or it's not. There might be some space in between, such as, like I was starting to say, there can be vivid perceptions that are unclear, like pain. It's hard for me to think of something that's clear but not vivid. I mean, Descartes wouldn't say this, but I think of math as clear but not vivid. Just is not something that has vividness for me. Descartes probably considered that a vulgar understanding of math. But overall, I think Sam has a correct point that Descartes' world is, in a sense, black and white. Something's either true or it's not. So there's a lot of room for skepticism with Descartes. But hopefully it's clear what the standard of truth is for him. Also in the third meditation, after stating that his criterion for the truth is very much contingent on the existence of God, he goes through pretty great lengths to try to prove the existence of God. So this would be one of those, taking a step back, this would be one of the classic questions that people bother with philosophy about at all in the first place. So maybe or maybe not, we agree with Descartes that it's a good idea, a good use of one's time to, at least once in one's life, doubt everything to the maximum. Most people don't. But a classic question for philosophy will be, does God exist? Can the existence of God be proven on the basis of reason alone? And Descartes answers yes. So it's incumbent on us to ask whether he does a good job of that. So going back to attributes that Descartes noticed about himself, the thinking being that he was, toward the end of the list, he mentions he imagined many things involuntarily and was aware of others that seemed to come from the senses. He acknowledges that he's not just floating in space. That might be the context for his discussion of God, which before I get into it, let me look at the chat. Yeah, I think Evelyn raises a very good question, is which God? People believe in hundreds of different kinds of gods, all kinds of religious traditions. Descartes speaks about a God singular. So he seems to be a monotheist. There is no mention of Christ, I don't believe, in the Meditations. So it's not clear to me whether Descartes' God could be considered a traditional Christian God. I mean, he was writing in a Christian context, but it is a great question to what extent the God described by Descartes is similar, and to what extent is this God different from a sort of more conventional Christian God. I would say that this God actually has a lot in common with the God discussed by some Catholic theologians who came a long time before Descartes, but is also, if nothing else, much more impersonal than the God one comes across, at church, or maybe at a mosque or synagogue. This seems to be a very abstract God, but it's an open question. It's a great question, Evelyn. Open, unanswered one to my mind. But out of these ideas, Descartes acknowledges in his discussion of being a thinking being, and he says, come without him even willing them. He claims to have an innate idea of God. And it's actually, I think, a very eloquent analogy, like the mark of a craftsman impressed upon his work. So maybe I never bought any crafts, but I bought a Calvin Klein jacket last year. It says Calvin Klein on it. Okay, so the company or a poor worker made the jacket, puts Calvin Klein on the jacket. Descartes is saying, in the same way, God put God's mark on Descartes, is what Descartes is claiming. This is something he says he perceives vividly and clearly. So again, that standard of truth. He just has this idea inside of him. He didn't make it up himself, and he is as certain about it as he is of the fact he exists. We can raise a lot of questions about that, but kind of let's try to do a sympathetic reading of Descartes and unpack what he may mean before we start to tear it apart. It's in the third meditation that Descartes gives a whole theory of representation, an attempt to explain the basis of our thoughts and perceptions. And in the case of God, Descartes claims there's an idea or representation of God, and he puts this idea or representation in terms of cause and effect. He claims that he is not his own cause of his idea of God. So where does the idea of God come from? He would reject, I don't think Descartes even entertains the possibility that God could be a product of sense perception or anything like that. He argues that when things are represented to one, the cause of the representation has, quote unquote, more reality than the thing that is represented. And God being innate fits, or I should say, that sort of schema of representation fits with Descartes' idea of God, that whatever idea Descartes has of God. It's not God himself that's in his mind or something. It has an external source, which is God itself. And Descartes, with his theory of representation, contends that this external God has more reality than Descartes' idea of it. And part of his proof of that is supposed to be God has attributes that could not have come from Descartes. Those attributes are said to include infinity, being self-independent, self-sufficient, maybe, being supremely intelligent and powerful. These are things, these are concepts that just could not have come from Descartes. They must be from God. Therefore, God exists. I think later on, Descartes states that his vivid and clear perception of God includes all of the perfections, existence as a perfection. Therefore, since God has all the perfections and existence is a perfection, God exists. As a kind of corollary to the third meditation, but still in the third meditation, Descartes makes a case that God is the only possible cause of Descartes himself, and he entertains other possibilities. Like, did he create himself, or was it just his parents that created him? But I think the main argument for God is, again, that Descartes has an innate idea of God, and Descartes could not have come up with this idea on his own. Therefore, and since the concept of God has all of these attributes that also could not have come from Descartes itself, therefore God exists. So Evelyn, I see your hand raised.
So since we humans, we created the word God and the ideology of having a God, and this is, this happened all over the world back in, like thousands of years, cultures and stuff. We invented that, the idea of God, whether it was for hope, to explain natural forces, to give us, a sense of a reality or create a reality for us. So it's kind of, for me, it's kind of confusing saying the reasons for existence of God, since we are the ones that created the reasons for the existence of a God. So
Yeah.
I feel like the question is backwards.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think that's more of like an anthropological or social sciences way of framing the question. When talking about God in an anthropology class or a history class, we might look at the religious practices that gave rise to this, that, or the other idea of God. But Descartes is claiming, because again, keeping in mind this project that he's undertaken, he's doubted the foundations of everything to the maximum possible extent. He says that he's proved that he exists, and now he's starting to sort of explore what else might exist. But at this stage in the meditations, he has not claimed, as far as I could tell, anything else about other human beings, let alone about other human beings' conceptions of God. He is very much in a kind of isolation, meditating on what God is. So part of his radical doubt of everything will have been to reject any church conception of God. He's trying to come up to, or sort of uncover what knowledge he has of God by himself. And this is what he claims his knowledge is. So it's very different than, I mean, what you're saying makes a lot of sense to me. And I think that looking at, human practices around God is like a really fruitful way of trying to think about God. But Descartes is rejecting that path. He's claiming that all of this is in his, basically, so to speak, in his own hand. So the question is, do we buy that? And Maya, I see your hand raised.
I think I don't quite understand his justification for why him believing something vividly and clearly definitely makes it true.
Yeah.
Because yeah, it doesn't seem like he's really proved that particularly well.
Yeah. How could I? So say I find his standard of truth, being, if vivid and clear thing, more persuasive than his proof of the existence of God. Why do I feel that way? I mean, to state it negatively, it might be there are some things that just can't be doubted. That's different than what Descartes says, but that's the best that.
Isn't that kind of what he's trying to do, though? To doubt everything? Like,
right. Yeah. So this is my like interpretation. So there's some things that can't be doubted, and those things are known with vividness and clarity. And anything that has similar vividness and clarity is also certain.
so his proof of the existence of God is that for him, the existence of God is one of those things that just can't be doubted.
It's more than that. I think that God to him is both a vivid and clear perception, but then he tries to come up with a theory for how the idea of God arose, which to Descartes is supposed to be part of the proof. Namely, God, the idea of God was caused by God, the same way, and put in Descartes, the same way a craftsman puts their mark on a work. So there's, yeah.
He never really met an atheist.
What's that?
It kind of feels like he never really met an atheist.
Yeah.
But it
Yeah,
doesn't seem like doubt of God has really been a possibility to him.
Yeah, well, it's interesting in the preface, which is not in the PDF, he talks about atheists. And I mean, this goes back to the big question about Descartes. Did he basically really believe what he was saying about God? And there's room for skepticism. But if we take him at face value, he's saying things that are appropriate for the church at his time, including in the preface, when he mentions atheists, he states, I mean, he's very dismissive of atheism, which I think would have been in keeping with sort of scholarship of his day. I mean, atheism is still a major taboo. What Descartes would, I think, say about atheists is that they have an innate idea of God, and if they reflected, they would have a vivid and clear perception of that God, but they just haven't done that. I mean, you've touched on a major problem for me with his proof of the existence of God, because I don't have any idea of God. But what Descartes would say to me is, I'm just in ignorance of that idea, and that if I did something similar to him, I would find that. I mean, it's probably not a good answer, but that's, I mean, I think what Descartes would say. Does that make sense?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah, no problem. Sam, did I see your hand raised? No, sorry. Okay. Going to the chat real quick. Briley wrote, in this sense, God is referring to any life creator. Descartes was a devout, I think this means devout Christian. So he believed in the biblical God, but a lot of the time, God is just any belief that we were creating by someone something rather than we exist by pure scientific repetition. I mean, I think this touches on Evelyn's very good point. I mean, to what extent is God purely a human creation? And I think so. The first thing in your first sentence, Briley, God refers to any life creator. I mean, I think that's a major attribute of God for Descartes. So he might agree with the spirit of your first sentence, but I think he would disagree with your second sentence that God is the human creation. Like he really seems to think that, or he argues that God, the idea of God was created by God and we just have it. So I don't necessarily buy that. I mean, I think there's I think you all are raising great points that, yes, let's be skeptical about Descartes, especially this proof. So, I mean, this is a great discussion. Anyone else have a thought on Descartes' proof of God? Or, I mean, Maya brought up the vivid and clear standard for the truth. Is that persuasive? And if it's not, how could we do better? Okay, my own hand is raised. I don't want that. Yes, Maya.
I guess it kind of seems to me like he kind of backed himself into a corner with radical doubt. Like, I don't really think we can do better. Like, I think if you're gonna really doubt everything and there could be a demon who's deceiving all your senses, then that's it. Like, it's really hard to build on that.
Yeah. I mean, I think it's possible that Descartes is right about, kind of the first part of his project. Radically doubt, if you radically doubt everything, you will find that there is basically no good basis for your views. He may not successfully resolve his own problem. I mean, I want to agree with the first part of his answer, the I am, comma, I exist assertion. I would tend to agree with the idea that no force can disprove to one that one exists. But then I think what you raised for me, Maya, is that standard of vividness and clarity adequate? Maybe not. And if not, can you prove anything other than that you just exist? Evelyn, I see your hand is raised also.
So after reading Aristotle and jumping into Descartes now, I think he had a good idea, but the way that he developed it, I think he came really short to explain it, especially because he forgets about accountability. And I feel like he doesn't he isolate himself like he was like a different species, but he forgets the human part, I guess, that includes, for example, humans. We do mistakes, and how mistakes are an evolution path for us learning to knowledge and all of that. So I just feel like it became really short on explaining, and he doesn't explain much what is really a god for him. He only just said like, oh, clarity and da da, but that's as far as he goes. Like, you need, I feel like you need more than that, that it
Yeah,
can
I'm sorry.
so it can connect to further parts of humanity, and our self-awareness around the world, the way that nature versus nurture, like he can really really undeveloped, I think, the way he wrote all this.
Yeah. Well, let me ask you, do you think that we reach understanding of reality as a kind of group consensus?
Well, I mean, I do believe like we are collective knowledge. We do actually humans. For example, the reason why I think human beings have survived from small tribes, and why being a part of that tribe back in the day was so essential, because we were passing knowledge from our old parents to young generation, and that's how we kept humanity, right? Passing through knowledge. So for me, knowledge is collective between us, and yes, so I do believe that can you repeat the question? I'm sorry, I
I'm
kind
just
of.
asking, does our knowledge of reality, is that a product of group consensus? Or do
Yeah,
we?
of course.
Yeah.
Of course. For example, I mean, for example, we know peer pressure. We try to fit in to be, or we even change our personality, the ways we dress, the way we speak, or everything to be part of our group. So, yes, it's part of us. Especially now as a society, it's still playing a big role. But
Does,
is that our own personal reality? No, but is the reality we live in or we coexist with?
yeah. Does that extend to knowledge of the self? For instance, is knowledge of Evelyn a product of society, and is knowledge of Shant a product of society, or is it possible to have self-knowledge without on an individual basis?
I think it depends on the way you grew up. For example, I was born in another country. I was raised in a different way. So coming here to America, it gave me the opportunity to see the world from different perspectives. So I think it's all about perspective. The more open you are to world perspective and you are coming, especially as you were growing up as a child, it will give you, to a certain extent, the benefits to go in and to go out, I think.
Yeah.
To, yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting. I mean, I think it raises a lot of great points. And I mean, and bringing it back to Aristotle, some people consider Aristotle a sociologist, and that might be a major explanation for the difference between his idea of human essence and Descartes. I mean, that you could write a book or multiple books, and I'm sure people have, on the difference between Descartes and Aristotle. I think one big difference would be Aristotle seems to have, even though he calls it a scientific understanding of human essence, it also seems more sociological. And he after all gave us this definition that a human being is meant for a city, or a human being is a political animal. You get none of that in Descartes. So Aristotle, or more broadly, a sociological view of human essence, might be much richer than Descartes, the idea that of an individual that Descartes gives us. Then the problem becomes, if you take Descartes seriously, which I think we should, is that the best we can do? Is just say a human is a thinking being, period, and not all this other stuff like a political animal and a product of social conditions, and has a relationship with God that's mediated by history and culture and context. So I think it's a great point. We're not going to answer it today, but I'm glad you brought it up. So I think we're on track to get through the rest of the meditations before the end of class. So meditation 4, Descartes seems very confident in what he's accomplished so far. And another thing I'll say in defense of Descartes is that he may just seem like a guy who's talking a good game, but delivering a bunch of impractical and unsubstantiated opinions. However, as far as this method that he repeatedly talks about, he would also claim that it was applying it that led him to create modern analytic geometry. So a Cartesian would say he both walked the walk and talked the talk. I mean, if you have done something major, which, not really being a math person, I don't fully appreciate analytic geometry, but again, this is like a precursor to calculus, so very sophisticated accomplishment in math. If that's what you pulled off, that's impressive to me. And it would seem, if Descartes would say, to be an endorsement of the method that he kind of gives us in the Meditations on First Philosophy and a few other works. So that's a Cartesian defense of Descartes, the polymath person who worked in many fields. After giving us this standard for the truth, which Descartes feels really good about, he asks what might seem like a not very obvious question, but why does he still make mistakes? If knowledge and truth are based upon vivid and accurate perceptions, how is it possible to go wrong so often? Which he, as a mathematician and scientist, no doubt does. Why would scientists even need to do experiments if they have this gold standard for the truth? If everything that is in me comes from God and he didn't equip me, he's putting it back in the context of God, which is probably even more important. And God didn't equip him with the capacity for making mistakes, doesn't it follow that I can never go wrong in my beliefs? And here Descartes gives several general reasons how God could have created reality and still allow for Descartes to make mistakes. One is the sort of time-honored idea. I wouldn't say necessarily say time-honored, but this very old idea that God can do things people cannot know. Maybe that's why humans are capable of making errors. Descartes also tosses out this possibility that human error may play a role in the universe, which is simply unknown. Our individual mistakes in service of a higher purpose. But the specific reason Descartes gives, yeah, and Evelyn points out, making mistakes is part of learning. That seems very much so, but why would it be that, why would God create reality and seem to arrange things so that trial and error mistakes have to happen? Why don't we come into the world like a computer that's already programmed with everything we need to do? Like if I do calculations, then I'll make a billion mistakes and maybe never even get it right. But a computer has a calculator, it will never go wrong. Why aren't we more like that? So yes, we did create the computer, but it took us years to develop. Why didn't God make us more like that? Would be a question, is the kind of question Descartes seems to be asking. And then this theory that he gives hinges on a distinction between the intellect, that faculty of the mind, and the will, which seems to be another kind of faculty. It's interesting that right after determining, kind of whittling down human essence to being a thinking being, Descartes brings in will. You might ask, where does that come from? But Descartes states that his will has a wider scope than his intellect has. In other words, he wants to know more things than he is capable of knowing. Sometimes he bites off more than he can chew. And maybe that does, going back to Evelyn's point, change over time. When you're a child, and if you were a great student, no doubt like Descartes was, maybe you want to do advanced math problems. That would be your will, but you don't yet have the intellect for that. It'll take years and years until your intellect can match your will. But even by the time you die and you learn all these wonderful things like Descartes did, there will still be things that you want to know that the intellect is just not capable of knowing. One might ask for examples. I think a classic, the classic one is the existence of God. I mean, there's a school of thought that human beings are not capable of knowing whether God exists. Descartes thinks they are. What would be a question Descartes thinks is unanswerable, yet people still want to answer? Maybe you all tell me. Are there any unanswerable questions that come to mind? Or can everything be solved?
We still don't know who was the first human on Earth to walk on Earth. So
Sure. Yeah, I was also interested, like thinking of more broadly the origin of the universe, or could bring it to more recently. When did the first human being come into existence? I mean, there are physicists who try to answer the first question. There are archaeologists who try to answer the second, but these questions may never be known. Any other examples come to mind? I'm sure there are things. Mistakes. Why do mistakes happen? And is this a good way of phrasing it? Your will has a wider scope than the intellect does. Does anyone do sports? Mistakes happen in sports all the time. Does that have anything to do with the intellect?
no more with a physical training. If you have trained, you can do it. But you still, for example, most of sport I do running, and 90% I would say is mental. The moment you give up in your mind,
Yeah.
that's it. Your body's not going nowhere.
Yeah, absolutely. So I mean, yeah, I think sports are like hugely psychological, but and even a great athlete. So in baseball, if you hit the ball 50% of the time, that's considered, or less than 4 out of 10 times, it's considered an amazing baseball player, but you're still missing 6 out of 10 times. Why does that happen? Like Descartes does not have sports in mind, I don't think. Something makes me think he was not a sports fan. But I think there's lots of examples we could apply this question to. Why do mistakes happen? Okay, so after that kind of, not exactly digression, but with a meditation, Descartes still hasn't quite put knowledge of the external world, which he's been shooting for seemingly this whole time, on solid ground. He's still only asserted that he exists, that God exists, and he seems to have started to approach the essence of external bodies as exemplified by the wax, but he hasn't gotten there yet. So it's along the way that Descartes states, or comes to conclude, that mathematical objects also exist in a vivid and clear way. Let me pull up the text just to set the stage a bit better. And I think the argumentation is something like the human mind is structured so that it cannot help but accept the truth of these mathematical objects. He states, he has countless ideas of certain things, even if perhaps they do not exist anywhere outside me, cannot be said to be nothing. And although in a sense I think them at will, nevertheless they are not something I have fabricated. Rather, they have their own true and immutable, unchangeable natures. And he states, it is evident from the fact that various properties can be demonstrated regarding this triangle, namely that its 3 angles are equal to 2 right angles, etc., etc. These are properties I now clearly acknowledge whether I want to or not, even if I previously had given them no thought whatever when I imagined the triangle. For this reason, then, they were not fabricated by me. So he seems to be making a claim about the nature of the mind. It's structured in such a way that it cannot help but assent to certain things about mathematical objects, whether or not they even exist in reality. They cannot be denied in the way that if someone imagines a unicorn, or I think Descartes' example was a winged horse, can be denied. It is possible for the mind to deny that a winged horse exists, but the mind, according to Descartes, cannot deny certain properties of triangles and many other mathematical objects, that 3 angles in a triangle add up to 2 right angles, and all of that fun stuff from elementary school geometry. Similarly, he claims that his comments on God in the 5th meditation are an additional proof of the existence of God. He can no more think of God lacking the perfection of existence than triangles having certain properties. Is anyone here a math major? Or thinking of being a math major? I have no math majors.
I'm a physics major, sorry.
Okay. Does this sound like a good explanation of what happens when you think about equations in physics, or maybe laws of physics?
Well, when I think of laws of physics, I tend to think of it through a more scientific lens than a religious lens. But I guess it would be a good excuse for the existence of God, is how everything is so mathematically correct and there is just so everything's down to a T.
Yeah. Well, let me ask, let's leave God out for a minute. Let me ask this. Does his description of kind of the relationship between the mind and mathematical objects, which again is something like the mind seems to be structured in such a way that it cannot disagree with certain aspects of math, and I think it could be extended to laws of physics. Is that a good explanation of how the mind thinks of math and science?
Yeah, I do completely agree that it is hard, or you cannot dispute some mathematical evidence.
Yeah. Yeah. And in the context of Descartes, we could ask ourselves, why doesn't he just start out with math and say math is the standard of truth? There's lots of people who would say that. I don't know why that doesn't seem to be good enough for Descartes. But even though he is a big math guy, and clearly has, you would not say faith, but we could say a lot of faith in math. A counter argument to Descartes would be, I think, non-Euclidean geometry, which I really don't know a lot about, but it is a form of geometry that plays with and undermines what had long been taken to be laws of geometry, and let alone, Riley, maybe you tell us, quantum physics. Is the human mind structured so that it must accept relativity? I don't really know that much about relativity, but I know it's hard to grasp. So that in and of itself, it's not self-evident necessarily. That might make us skeptical of Descartes' theory that mathematical objects are as firmly known and knowable as one's own existence. But anyway, so just food for thought. Descartes in the Fifth Meditation, again, tries to make this case that along with the self and the existence of God, mathematical objects are another realm that is totally firm because of factors like the vividness and clarity with which the mind perceives them, and the fact, according to Descartes, that the mind cannot perceive them in any other way. This still leaves the question of how much can be known about actual bodies, these touchable, smellable, visible things in the outside world. So to sort of reiterate, Descartes this whole time has been completely skeptical about sense perceptions, but before he started out on the meditations, he took it for granted that he had a body, that sensations were real, and so were properties of outside bodies. And he assumed his ideas of bodies. So right now, that could be the building across the street, it could be the plant in my room, and so on and so forth. He assumed that his ideas corresponded to them in reality. However, in his project of radical doubt, he cites experience that undermines his faith in the senses. And we could go on and on talking about not only Descartes' examples, but also maybe even examples from our own lives. Okay, you see a tower from far away, it looked like a rectangle, but it's actually circular, it's a cylinder. Or a great example, I think, from Descartes is what we would now call a phantom limb. Someone loses an arm or a leg, yet nevertheless, they think that they still feel pain or itching or something in this leg or arm that they no longer have. This really interesting phenomenon a lot has been written about. He's noticed he is, quote unquote, liable to error even in the matters that seem most true. So he'll state, the remaining task is to consider whether material things exist. He does state that sense perceptions must come from the outside. He rules out the sense perceptions, something he touched on in meditation too. He sometimes involuntarily has ideas about other things. He seems to rule out that he himself is generating these sense perceptions with no cause other than his own mind. He also rules out that God would be responsible for sense perceptions, because that would mean God is responsible for deceptions, for things like feeling, when an amputee feels an itch or a pain in a limb they no longer have. So the only possible option left, according to Descartes, are bodies themselves. So here we are. Descartes is saying that bodies actually exist. It's not just the self, God, and the mathematical ideas in one's head. There are things out there. But then the immediate question becomes, what can be known about them? And that's where he brings back the standard of truth he says he's established, that if something is vivid and clear, it must be true, it cannot be false. And some examples he goes through, I think, include pain. What could be more real than pain? But Descartes states, and what could be more real? This is where we get into the mind-body dualism. What could be more real than the body? It's like, well, by this point, Descartes has only stated that he, in the aspect or essence of being a thinking being, exists. He has not stated that his body exists, which might sound weird, but that's his line of reasoning. What could be more real than the body? It's like, if there's one thing, like if you think about a baby or an infant or something, it seems to be more aware of its body than of its mind, certainly. Nevertheless, I think he provides a pretty powerful example when he's talking about pain. Pain may, yes, be vivid, but according to Descartes, and I would tend to agree, it is not clear. And maybe it's happened to you, maybe or maybe not, it's happened to you that, or I'll speak for myself. And I was in a car accident once, and my car was hit while I was driving, and luckily nothing was broken or anything, but my body was just totally in shocked. Like there was bruising and things like that. But it took a while for me to sort of locate the source of the pain. There was this vivid, overwhelming sensation of pain, but it was not clear. Or to use another translation, it was not distinct. It was a general sensation of pain. Or sometimes, it's hard to tell if there's an itch. It's hard to tell exactly where the itch is or something like that.
Wouldn't that be as a result also of our body goes and our brain goes into flight or high mode? And
sure. Yeah, but I think that would only prove Descartes' point more, right? There are not only moments where they're phantom limbs, there are times where, and they're not only times when you don't have a distinct idea of pain, but there are also times you go into shock, or there's so much adrenaline in your body that it's like the sense perception shuts down. In that case, it's not only unclear, it's also not vivid. So anyway, so according to Descartes, these would all exemplify that we cannot have certain knowledge of the body, and relatedly, either one's own body or objects, physical things in the outside world. Again, he said that sense perceptions do come from the outside. At this point, hopefully it's clear, it means outside the mind. So my sense perception of my hand moving around or whatever does come from a body outside the mind. But not only are those sense perceptions neither vivid nor clear, but Descartes takes it a bit further and states there's no solid, firm reason, according to his standard of truth, to think that these sensual properties like color, taste, and sound truly correspond to the bodies we associate with them. So right now we're all looking at a screen, and this slide is shades of gray. There's some faces of people on the window to the side, and there are sound waves coming from speakers. Descartes would argue that we do not have proof, as much as it may seem, that this slide really is gray in shades of gray, and that these sounds really are being emitted, at a certain decibel range and caused by, transmission over Wi-Fi or whatever. That is not the case, according to Descartes. We cannot prove that that's the case. And the only thing that is certain about the outside world is that are those aspects of it that we can vividly and clearly perceive. Those will again be the mathematical properties of things. Or I think properties that, maybe the different way to phrase it is those that can be apprehended by the pure forms of mathematics, such as extension, shape, and motion, and related properties. So bringing it back to the second meditation, where he was talking about the essence of a ball of wax, right then and there, he asserted that it's only an activity, a scrutiny of the mind alone that discerns the essence of a ball of wax, that its color, its taste, its smell, its hardness or softness were unreliable, maybe secondary or accidental attributes of the ball of wax. It just had an essence consisting of a certain extension and maybe a malleability, being manipulable in a certain way. So Descartes is basically reiterating that in the sixth meditation, but about all bodies. So I have a pothos plant across from me. I think it looks green. I can never imagine myself saying the pothos plant is not green. But then Descartes would point out, can I prove it? And I don't know how I would prove it. So that's what Descartes leaves us with. And from this, and luckily we have a few minutes to wind things down, though maybe we'll continue the chat a bit next week. Descartes gives us what's now called mind-body dualism, which I said at the beginning is not his own terminology. It's kind of a label that's been applied ever since. So Descartes states the mind is known certainly and indubitably. He has a vivid and clear perception that he exists. The body, in contrast, is maybe vivid, but it's not clear, and it does not exist with certainty and free of doubt. So Descartes takes the distinction further and asserts that mind and body are distinct, which I think is whether they are is a great question that has a lot of ramifications, only some of which he touches on in the meditations. And here again, he provides a somewhat peculiar and counterintuitive form of reasoning, which is known, not his term, but it's been applied to his argumentation as the conceivability argument. Everything Descartes vividly and clearly understands can be created by God to correspond to that understanding, is his premise. Very debatable, but that's what he states in the sixth meditation. Then Descartes asks, or excuse me, Descartes asserts that he has a vivid conception, vivid and clear perception that mind and body are separate. The fact he has that perception and the fact that anything so perceived can happen in reality under a all-powerful and never-erring and infinite God means, according to Descartes, that mind and body are in fact separate. This is they're intermingled, but fundamentally separate. And he leaves it an open question how the mind and body intersect. Okay, nowadays, what would we say the mind is? I think the typical, yes, Maya.
I mean, I think biologically it's it's like neurons in our brain interacting with each other and creating connections and things like that.
Yeah, absolutely. The mind is the brain, according to modern science. I think in ancient times there was a theory that the heart was the seat of the mind. But at any rate, it's a widespread view known as a empiricist view, is that the mind is the body, specifically the brain. Descartes is stating that that is not the case, which leaves open a lot of interesting, it raises a lot of questions and leaves open a lot of interesting possibilities, such as the idea that the mind can exist after the body dies. Descartes says that in passing in the preface, which was not included in the reading, but he did seem to say that he thought the mind can survive when the body dies, which leaves open the possibility for an afterlife. So this is mind body dualism kind of thing I would probably put on a quiz. But with our last few minutes of class, I think I'm going to pause the recording. But I want to ask everyone what you think.